continuing now our conversation about frontline healthcare workers during this pandemic. There was a recent headline in the Boston Herald, Boston MedFlight transporting coronavirus patients across New England due to lack of beds. I'm sure many of you, our listeners, are familiar with Boston MedFlight. They are a nonprofit critical care air and ground transport service. Maybe people don't know that, but they are a nonprofit. They were founded in 1985 by a consortium of Boston's leading academic medical centers, Mass General, Brigham and Women, the BI, Children's Hospital, Tufts, Leahy, and on. And this is their 35th year of service. We wanted to bring in the CEO right now, Maura Hughes. Maura, thank you very much for joining us. If you could, tell us a little bit about Boston MedFlight, describe the structure, and give us a little taste of how busy you folks have been because of this pandemic.
Sure. Well, you gave us a great intro there. But what our mission is really to care for the region's most critically ill and injured patients. So whether someone has had a crash, automotive crash on the side of the road, or if they're critically ill in a community hospital and need to get to a higher level of care, that's where we come in. And we have a fleet of helicopters, critical care ground ambulances, which are basically mobile ICUs, and we have an airplane for longer distance missions. And on our transports, we have critical care nurses and critical care paramedics taking care of you. And we really take care of every age, from the itty-bitty premature baby that can fit into the palm of your hand to the 102-year-old and everything in between. But this 2020 and 2021 has been extremely challenging for us. We realized COVID was on the horizon in late February, early March, and our clinical crews and operational crews got together and said, okay, how are we going to best care for these COVID patients, and how are we going to make sure we keep our staff safe during these transports? And it's been a really, really busy 10 months.
Yeah, Maura, I'm so glad we're talking now, because even before COVID, I would look, when I was in Boston, I'd see one of your aircraft helicopters up there, and I always wondered, how does all this work? So forgive me for a few basic questions, but tell us about your fleet and how you work with these different healthcare institutions. I would suppose it's simply hospitals, and do you house your aircraft at these places, or do you have talk about everything? Give us the broad strokes.
That's a great question. I should go back a little bit about how we were formed. So, helicopters were used first in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, but in the late 70s, early 80s, they realized there was a civilian application, for this transport service. So we were started in 1985, and a couple of the Boston hospitals decided that they wanted to have an air medical service, and the Massachusetts Department of Public Health said, fabulous, but not all your Boston hospitals are going to have your own helicopter. You have to figure out a way to work together. So we are formed as a 501c3 nonprofit, so we're a separate standalone entity, but we've been supported by these Boston teaching hospitals for 35 years. And, we have 4 bases, and we fly out of 4 bases, and half of what we do actually is critical care ground. And on the finances side of the house, 80% of our revenue comes from billing patients' insurances. But of course, there's a lot of, patients who don't have insurance. And then 20% of our budget comes from charitable contributions from the general public and a subsidy from our hospitals. But, as a nonprofit, it's our mission to take care of you, whether you have insurance or not. And we give away over $5 million in free and unreimbursed care each year.
So just quickly, when you say a lot of your care is on the ground, what do you mean by that?
So we have critical care ambulances. So our ground ambulances are basically mobile ICUs. So there's a good number of patients that they don't need the speed of a helicopter. The helicopter is really used for time-sensitive patients, so folks having heart attacks, strokes, trauma, that sort of thing, or geographically isolated, like, Nantucket Martha's Vineyard. But the ground is really used for everything else. Any patients who are critically ill and are not time sensitive, we're actually transporting them on the ground. And the vast majority of COVID patients who have actually transported have actually been with our ground mobile units.
Talking with Maura Hughes. She is the CEO of Boston MedFlight, talking about their operations and the work that they're doing during this pandemic. If you could talk a little, given what we're hearing about hospital capacity, and again, the headline I saw on the Boston Herald, it's requiring what? That you pick up patients and take them to further away hospitals, local hospitals on the outskirts because of these the hospital bed situation?
I'll tell you, I've been in this business a long time. Our healthcare system in Boston is extremely sophisticated. We have excellent centers of care, in and around the city. But the fact of the matter is, everyone's full. I mean, you have, huge institutions that have 1 and 2 ICU beds. But this healthcare system is really working well together. They're taking each other's patients. They're moving patients around. But these are critically ill patients, and there's only certain services who can transport these patients. Some of these patients are so ill, we have to transport them prone, which means that they're on their they're lying on their front. They have breathing tubes inserted. But I will tell you that the hospitals are working very close together. So if hospitals get full, we are moving patients in and out of all the community hospitals and all of the tertiary level centers around. And it's worked really well. I've never seen this an unprecedented cooperation between all of these healthcare institutions.
So, Maura, are you the only ones I'd see up in the air? Do you have competitors, as it were?
So Eastern Massachusetts, Cape and the Islands, we're pretty much it. In Massachusetts,
Okay.
There's one helicopter at UMass and Worcester, and there's one helicopter in Springfield. But otherwise, it's us.
What
So,
about
I mean,
Angel
I-
Flight? Haven't you,
yeah, please.
Angel Flight is another name I've heard.
So Angel Flight is a nonprofit, but they have volunteer pilots and volunteer planes. And what they do are folks who are going for, cancer treatment, et cetera. So not critically ill. There's no medical treatment being provided on board. But what we're doing is it's a critical care nurse and a critical care paramedic, taking care of you during the transport.
Maura Hughes is CEO of Boston MedFlight. We're talking about their service, and it's a nonprofit in their relationship with hospitals, the extra strain that's been put on their system in COVID-19. Maura, one of the most intriguing questions I can think of is who decides and what's the criteria for getting someone on a helicopter? Now, if there's somebody seriously injured on Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, that becomes easier, I suppose. But I always wondered, how, I suppose to put it crassly, how badly injured do you have to be to necessitate a med flight?
So in the state of Massachusetts, there are criteria of when you call Boston MedFlight to the scene of a crash. So this will be, the state police will get there first, local city and town, EMTs, et cetera, will get there, fire services will get there, and there are criteria of when you actually call MedFlight to the scene. There's, a death on the scene, there's a extended extrication, folks need blood, et cetera. So that's on the scene. So that's only about 10% of what we do. The vast majority of what we do are taking patients from community hospitals into the tertiary level hospitals, and it's the physician at the bedside who decides if Boston MedFlight is needed.
Mm-hmm. Talking to Maura Hughes, CEO of Boston MedFlight. We've heard so much about capacity during this pandemic and this recent surge. The Massachusetts Nurses Association, we had the president on the other day. She's concerned about the ICU protocols being changed in some hospitals, allowing nurses to take care of more than 2 people. What has it been like for you folks? What is the situation with Boston MedFlight? How stressed are you by what is happening here right now with the surge?
Well, it's a challenge. We're coming up on transporting our 1,200th COVID patient over the last 10 months, and it's extremely strenuous on the crews. They take twice as long as other transports because you have, because these patients are so sick, first of all, you have to don and doff, PPE. all the disinfection, protocols that have to be followed, after the transport for all the vehicles. So it's really, really taxing. And in the spring, for us, our crews were doing nothing but COVID patients, call after call after call. Now what we're seeing is probably about 40% of what we do are these critically ill COVID patients, and the rest are just our regular transport, volume, the folks having heart attacks and strokes and sick premature babies, et cetera. But it's been a long 10 months. I really have to acknowledge the Boston MedFlight, frontline staff, for coming in and doing what they do every day.
Yeah. It's surprising to hear you say that. So it's about 40% COVID related right now. We're in the middle of a surge. I would imagine, as an observer from the outside looking in, that you'd be back up to what you were in the spring. That is, most of it's COVID work. Why did that switch like that, and why did it remain so?
I think, what happened in the spring was everything shut down. The hospitals weren't doing any elective surgeries at all. You have folks who weren't traveling. Everybody was shut down. But now, we're seeing, people are getting into automotive crashes and having traumas and, having, the heart attacks and strokes. And, when the hospitals stop doing their elective surgeries, we only do the surgeries that go wrong, so to speak. So with the hospitals shutting down completely pretty much in the spring, that's why we only saw COVID volume in the spring. And unfortunately, I think a lot of folks who should have been going to the hospital were delaying their care, which I think, was not good for patients at the time. So I think people are seeking care like they should.
Mm-hmm. Talking with Maura Hughes, CEO of Boston MedFlight. I'm curious about your pilots for your helicopters there. Are they your sole employees? And if so, how many do you have? Are they medically trained as well?
So we have what they call an FAA Part 135 certificate. So we are our own airline. So just like a JetBlue or American Airlines, we employ all of our pilots. We employ all of the maintenance technicians, et cetera, and they are absolutely the top of the line of what they do. They have what's called an ATP rating, which is the highest pilot rating, civilian pilot rating you can get, and we have a phenomenal group. I think at this stage we have over 20 pilots.
Yeah, is it hard to find people like that?
It's extremely hard to find folks because we require that you have a lot of experience. But we've been very, very lucky to get a bunch of new folks in here over the last 10 years that come with a variety of experience. We hire folks who have retired from the Coast Guard, folks who have retired from the Army or the Navy. We also have corporate folks who have been flying corporate. So it's always a challenge because our bar is very high, but we have a good reputation, so it's that helps us recruit, the excellent pilots that we have.
Yeah.
Maura Hughes, CEO of Boston MedFlight. Final question for you, Maura. Tom and I love to ask this question for folks like yourselves, who we are always curious about in terms of what is on your desk. What is your number one priority that you're looking at right now?
My number one priority is keeping our staff safe and healthy through this pandemic and taking the absolutely best care of patients that we can.
Well, that's a good answer. All right. Maura Hughes, CEO of Boston MedFlight. We do appreciate you taking time and joining us today on Bloomberg Bay State Business. Stay well, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Sure.